My dad secretly sold my 500K property. He didn't expect me at the closing table. It wasn't just any property, not a fixer-upper in some forgotten town or a starter condo. This was the lakefront cottage my grandparents had left me, a place where summers were measured in mosquito bites and the scent of pine needles, a place that held the echoes of every family Christmas and 4th of July. 50 years of memories, and Dad, my own father, had signed it away for a cool $500,000. I found out not from him, not through some official notification, but through a casual, almost offhand comment from Aunt Carol at Thanksgiving dinner. "Oh, Sarah," she'd said, her voice dripping with that faux sympathy she'd perfected over decades. "I heard you finally unloaded the cottage. Such a shame, but I suppose it was getting to be a bit much for you to manage." Unloaded, as if it were a pile of junk mail. My stomach had dropped, a cold, heavy stone plummeting into the pit of my being. I'd managed to smile, to nod, to ask about her prize-winning poodle, while inside a silent scream was building. My cottage, my inheritance, my sanctuary, gone, and sold by my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to understand what that place meant. The house, a sprawling colonial with manicured lawns and a 3-car garage, always felt like a museum of my father's success, a testament to his shrewd business dealings and his unwavering belief in his own superior judgment. He was a self-made man, or so he constantly reminded us, a titan of industry who'd built his empire from the ground up. My mother, bless her gentle soul, had always been the quiet force behind the throne, a curator of comfort and tradition, while Dad commanded the boardroom and, apparently, the dispersal of my own assets. We were at the Thanksgiving table, the air thick with the cloying sweetness of pumpkin pie and the forced cheer of a family reunion. My brother, Mark, was already 2 glasses of expensive scotch deep, recounting his latest golf triumph with a boisterous laugh that grated on my nerves. He'd always been Dad's golden boy, the heir apparent, destined to inherit the family fortune and the family business. I was the quiet one, the artist, the dreamer, the one who'd chosen a life less conventional, a life that didn't involve quarterly reports and power suits. Dad, perched at the head of the table, his silver hair gleaming under the chandelier, surveyed his domain with a proprietary air. He'd always treated my choices with a sort of amused condescension, as if my artistic pursuits were a charming hobby, a phase I'd eventually outgrow. The cottage, however, was a different matter. It was an asset, a tangible piece of the family legacy, and it was mine, or so I thought. After Grandma passed, Dad had insisted on managing the estate, claiming it was too much for me to handle. He'd handled everything, from the probate to the property taxes, always with a reassuring smile and a pat on the back. He'd promised to keep it pristine, to ensure its preservation, a sentiment he'd repeated at my grandmother's funeral, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll keep it in the family, Sarah," he'd said, his hand on my shoulder. "Your grandmother would have wanted that." I'd believed him. I'd trusted him. The news from Aunt Carol hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, my fork clattering against my plate. I forced myself to breathe, to pretend that her words hadn't landed with the force of a bomb. "Oh, really?" I managed, my voice a little too high. I hadn't heard anything. Mark, bless his oblivious heart, chimed in. "Yeah, Dad was telling me about it. Said it was a good deal. Bought a nice fixer-upper for himself. Needed some work, but a real steal." A fixer-upper for him? My breath hitched. He'd sold my sanctuary, my childhood haven, and was using the proceeds to buy himself another property? The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical wound. I looked at Dad, who was now casually buttering a roll, his expression unreadable. He met my gaze for a fleeting moment, and I saw nothing. No apology, no shame, just a flicker of something that might have been impatience, or perhaps a silent dare. In that instant, the illusion of the loving, protective father shattered, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. The rest of the evening was a blur. I picked up my food, offered polite monosyllabic responses, and deflected any attempts at conversation. My mind was racing, piecing together the puzzle. The hushed phone calls Dad had been making lately, the late nights he'd been spending in his study, the vague excuses about important business matters. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. He hadn't just sold the cottage, he'd orchestrated the whole thing behind my back. He'd used his position as executor, his supposed authority, to circumvent my ownership, to treat my inheritance as his personal piggy bank. The audacity of it was staggering. I felt a seething anger begin to bubble beneath the surface, a raw, primal rage that I struggled to contain. I excused myself early, claiming a migraine, and drove home through the dark, silent streets, the city lights blurring through a haze of unshed tears. Back in my small apartment, the quiet was deafening. I sank onto the sofa, the comfortable emptiness of the room amplifying the hollowness inside me. I replayed Aunt Carol's words, Dad's casual dismissal, Mark's oblivious confirmation. He'd sold my $500,000 property, my legacy, my memories. For what? A summer home? A portfolio expansion? He hadn't even bothered to tell me. He treated me like a child, like someone incapable of managing her own affairs, someone who needed to be taken care of, even if that care involved seizing her most cherished possessions. The humiliation was a bitter pill to swallow. I, the independent artist, the rational adult, had been sidelined, deceived by the very person who was supposed to be my staunchest ally. I thought of Grandma, her kind eyes, her gentle hands, her unwavering faith in me. What would she think? Would she even recognize the man my father had become? The next few weeks were a silent war. I avoided all contact with my family, letting their calls go to voicemail, their texts unanswered. I needed time to process, to strategize, to figure out how to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The initial shock and betrayal gave way to a steely resolve. I wasn't going to let this slide. I wasn't going to be silenced or dismissed. I started digging. I contacted the real estate agent who handled the sale, a slick, smooth-talking man named Gary who'd always struck me as overly eager. He was initially evasive, citing client confidentiality, but a carefully worded legal inquiry from my lawyer, a woman I'd recently hired after this whole debacle, quickly changed his tune. He confirmed the sale, the price, and, crucially, the buyer, my father. The paperwork was extensive, a tangled web of legal jargon and financial transactions, all meticulously crafted to obscure the truth, to make it seem like a legitimate sale. But there it was, in black and white, my father's signature, authorizing the sale of my property. I also discovered something else, something that made my blood run cold. The cottage had been sold through a trust that my father had established years ago, ostensibly for estate planning purposes. I'd signed some documents related to it without fully understanding their implications, trusting his assurances that it was all standard procedure. It turns out, this trust gave him significant control over the assets placed within it, including the cottage, even after it was officially deeded to me. He hadn't just sold it, he'd manipulated the legal system, twisted the very documents he'd had me sign to gain control and then liquidate my inheritance. The man who'd lectured me about integrity and ethics was the architect of a sophisticated financial deception. The anger was no longer just a hot ember. It was a roaring inferno. I felt a chilling clarity wash over me. This wasn't just about the cottage anymore. This was about power. This was about control. This was about my father's insatiable need to dictate every aspect of our lives. The turning point came when I found an old, tarnished silver locket tucked away in a box of Grandma's things. Inside, nestled behind faded photographs of my grandparents, was a tiny folded piece of paper. It was a handwritten note from Grandma, dated years before she passed. It was addressed to me, but she'd never had the chance to give it to me. Her elegant script, so familiar, spoke of her worries about Dad's controlling nature, his tendency to see everything through the lens of profit and loss. She'd written about her hope that I would always hold on to the cottage, that it would remain a refuge for me, a place where I could be myself, away from the pressures of the family's expectations. She'd even mentioned that she'd made arrangements to ensure the cottage would be protected, hinting at a separate trust she'd set up, one that was solely for my benefit and couldn't be overridden by Dad's manipulations. My heart pounded. This was it. This was the key. This was the truth Dad had tried so desperately to bury. The cottage wasn't just a property. It was Grandma's legacy, a gift of freedom and sanctuary, and he had tried to steal it. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated the love that had been poured into that place, the strength that Grandma had tried to impart to me through her words and her actions. He thought he was buying himself a vacation home. He had no idea he was about to buy himself a war. I knew what I had to do. The silence had been my shield, my refuge for a few weeks, but now it was time for the storm. The weight of that discovery, the certainty of Grandma's foresight, settled into my bones with a profound sense of gravity. It wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a testament to my grandmother's love, a silent battle cry passed down through generations, a clandestine blueprint for my own reclamation. The trust Dad had manipulated, the one he'd used to divest me of my inheritance, was merely a superficial layer. Grandma's note, tucked away like a buried treasure, spoke of another layer, one he'd either overlooked, underestimated, or simply never known existed, a layer of protection designed specifically for me. I spent the next few days immersed in Grandma's legal papers, a daunting stack of documents that had been filed away after her passing, presumed to be mere formalities related to her estate. My lawyer, Miss Albright, a woman whose sharp intellect was as comforting as her unflappable demeanor, helped me navigate the dense legal jargon. We meticulously combed through every clause, every amendment, searching for the whispered promise in Grandma's note. The initial exhaustion of sifting through the paperwork was immense, but the hope ignited by that tiny scrap of paper propelled me forward. It felt like assembling a jigsaw puzzle in the dark, each piece a potential clue, each document a potential revelation. Then we found it. Buried deep within a portfolio of Grandma's financial investments, separate from her main estate, and managed by a different law firm, was a document I'd never seen before. It was a revocable living trust, established years before her death, with me as the sole beneficiary, and its primary asset, listed with an appraised value from that time, was the lakefront cottage. This wasn't a trust Dad had set up or managed. This was Grandma's own careful, deliberate creation. The key clauses within this trust were astonishing in their foresight. They stipulated that the cottage could not be sold without my express written consent, and if it ever were to be sold, the proceeds were to be held in a separate fund, managed by a trustee of Grandma's choosing, for my direct benefit and future security. The trustee was named my Uncle Robert, Dad's younger brother, a quiet, almost unassuming man who had always seemed to live in Dad's shadow but possessed a fiercely ethical core. Dad had played me, had played all of us, but he had fundamentally miscalculated Grandma's quiet strength and her love for me. He'd operated under the assumption that if he controlled the immediate legal framework surrounding the cottage, he controlled its fate. He'd forgotten about the deeper, more personal architecture Grandma had put in place. The realization dawned on me with a slow, creeping chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Dad hadn't just sold my cottage, he had violated the very spirit and letter of Grandma's legacy. He had acted with an arrogance so profound, so blinding, that he had overlooked the most critical safeguard of all. He had assumed his control over the family's legal and financial affairs extended to everything, that his will was absolute. He saw me as pliable, easily manipulated, just as he had always treated me. But Grandma had seen further. She had anticipated his nature, his predilection for control, his tendency to view family assets as his personal kingdom to rule. And she had protected me. She had provided me with the tools, the legal leverage, to reclaim not only the cottage, but also the truth of Dad's deception. This wasn't about a lawyer and a client anymore. This was about a granddaughter and her grandmother's final, endearing act of love. Miss Albright, usually so composed, looked genuinely impressed. "Sarah, your grandmother was a remarkable woman. This trust is airtight. Your father's sale is, at best, fraudulent. At worst, it's a clear violation of this trust's terms." The word fraudulent hung in the air, a heavy accusation that settled over me like a shroud. But beneath the grim reality, a nascent sense of power began to stir within me. I had the evidence, I had the legal backing, I had Grandma's foresight on my side. The humiliation of Thanksgiving, the gut-wrenching betrayal, the silent weeks of gnawing anger, they were all coalescing into a formidable force. I began to understand the true extent of Dad's machinations. He hadn't just sold the cottage for a profit. He'd likely used the sale to prop up some failing venture, to maintain his image of perpetual success, all while operating under the guise of handling family matters and acting in my best interest. The fixer-up he'd bought for himself was likely a symptom of a larger financial strain, a desperate move masked as a shrewd investment. The next step was contacting Uncle Robert. He lived about 3 hours north, in a quiet town nestled in the mountains, a world away from the bustling city and the cutthroat dealings of my father's empire. I drove up there on a crisp Saturday morning, the autumn leaves a blaze of color along the highway, His house was modest, a well-maintained cabin with a sprawling garden and a view of the distant peaks. He greeted me with his usual gentle smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He'd always been the calmer counterpart to Dad's aggressive ambition. We sat in his sunroom, the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee filling the air, and I laid out the entire story, from Aunt Carol's casual remark to the discovery of Grandma's trust. As I spoke, Uncle Robert's expression shifted from placid concern to a quiet, simmering outrage. He'd always respected Grandma deeply, and her foresight in protecting me resonated with him. "Your father," he began, his voice low and steady, "has always had a way of bending things to his will. He sees people as pieces on a chessboard. He didn't realize your grandmother was playing a different game entirely." He pulled out a thick ledger from a nearby bookshelf. "Your grandmother asked me to hold on to these records," he said, tapping the cover. "She suspected your father might try something like this. She wanted me to be a quiet observer, a guardian in case things went south. She never wanted you to be taken advantage of." He opened the ledger, revealing meticulous records of financial transactions, correspondences, and legal notes, all related to the cottage and the separate trust. It was a testament to Grandma's meticulous planning and Uncle Robert's quiet dedication to her wishes. He had been actively monitoring the cottage's status, documenting any irregularities, and waiting for the right moment to intervene. He had kept Dad's manipulation at bay, not through direct confrontation, but through careful observation and documentation, ready to step in when the time was right. The information in the ledger was damning. It detailed Dad's attempts to access funds from Grandma's trust for his own ventures, his veiled threats to Uncle Robert to cooperate for the family's financial stability, and his increasingly desperate attempts to re-engineer the cottage's ownership to circumvent Grandma's directives. He had, in fact, been trying to sell the cottage for years, but Grandma's trust and Uncle Robert's quiet resistance had always thwarted him. My father, the titan of industry, the man who projected an image of unassailable power and success, was apparently in a far more precarious financial position than he let on. The sale of my cottage, while a significant sum, was likely a desperate move to shore up his dwindling resources, a move he believed he could get away with because he controlled the narrative. He had underestimated the power of a grandmother's love and the quiet strength of a brother's loyalty.
"He believed he was untouchable," Uncle Robert continued, his gaze distant. "He's always seen family as another asset to be managed. He thought if he could just get the cottage sold, he could consolidate his position, maybe even use the profits to cover some debts he's been accumulating." He sighed, a heavy sound. "He's been playing a dangerous game, Sarah, and he's finally run out of luck." The anger that had been simmering within me for weeks began to crystallize into a cold, sharp resolve. This wasn't just about recovering my lost inheritance. It was about exposing my father's deceit, about shattering the carefully constructed facade of his perfect life, about showing him that his control had limits, and that I, the dreamer, the artist, was capable of wielding a power he'd never anticipated. We spent the rest of the day poring over the documents, strategizing. Miss Albright's legal team was already preparing the necessary filings. The plan was simple, but devastating. We would leverage Grandma's trust against Dad's fraudulent sale. We would demand the immediate restitution of the cottage's value, as stipulated in Grandma's trust, and sue for damages related to the fraudulent sale and breach of fiduciary duty. The implications for Dad's reputation, his business, and his standing within the community would be catastrophic. He had meticulously cultivated an image of integrity and shrewdness, and this would be the unraveling of it all. The thought of his shock, his absolute disbelief, sent a grim satisfaction through me. He deserved it. He had played with my inheritance, with my memories, with my trust. And now, the game was about to turn against him. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal preparations. I attended meetings with Miss Albright, reviewed affidavits, and provided sworn testimony. Each step felt like another stone being laid on the path to my vindication. The legal notices were served. The wheels of justice, slow but inexorable, began to turn. I didn't approach my father directly. I didn't need to. The legal documents would speak for themselves, each word a precisely aimed arrow piercing his carefully constructed defenses. I imagined his face when he first saw the summons, the bewildered anger, the dawning realization that his control had finally slipped through his fingers. He, who had always been the puppeteer, was about to find himself tangled in his own strings. The anticipation was a strange, potent cocktail of dread and exhilarating anticipation. I knew this was going to be ugly. I knew it would cause irreparable damage to what little remained of our family ties, but I also knew I couldn't let him get away with it. This was not just about money. It was about principle, about justice, about reclaiming my own narrative from the man who had tried to write it for me.
The family dinner was scheduled for the first Sunday in December, a traditional gathering at my parents' sprawling estate, usually a grand affair filled with forced pleasantries and passive-aggressive jabs. This year, however, the air felt different. I knew the legal proceedings had begun to circulate, hushed whispers in the corporate world, the faint tremors of an earthquake before the full devastation hits. I hadn't told Mark or my mother about the specifics, only that there was a serious legal matter involving the cottage. I wanted to see their faces when the truth, or at least the initial fallout, became undeniable. As I walked into the opulent foyer, greeted by the scent of expensive perfume and the clatter of crystal, I saw my father standing by the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked remarkably composed, his silver hair impeccably styled, his suit sharp. But his eyes, as they met mine, held a flicker of something I hadn't seen before, unease. He gave me a curt nod, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, and then turned away. The icy silence that passed between us was more eloquent than any shouted accusation. Mark, already nursing a drink, greeted me with his usual hearty, albeit slightly slurred, enthusiasm. "Sarah, good to see you. Heard things are complicated with the old place." He winked, a gesture that felt deeply inappropriate given the circumstances. "Dad said he got you a good deal on a new place, though. Smart move, getting out from under all that maintenance." He truly had no idea. He was still operating on the illusion my father had carefully curated. My mother, frail and anxious, gave me a weak smile from her armchair. She looked as though she carried the weight of the world on her slender shoulders, a perpetual expression of worry etched onto her face. She was the buffer, the peacemaker, the one who absorbed the fallout of my father's decisions, and I knew this latest crisis would weigh heavily on her. The conversation at dinner was strained, punctuated by my father's forced anecdotes about his latest business triumphs and Mark's increasingly loud pronouncements about his own perceived successes. I remained largely silent, observing, waiting. The tension was palpable, a coiled spring waiting to snap. Then, just as dessert was being served, the butler, a stoic man named Jenkins, entered the dining room, his expression unusually grave. He approached my father, who was in the middle of a self-aggrandizing story about a recent acquisition. "Sir," Jenkins said, his voice low but carrying through the suddenly hushed room, "there's a process server at the front door. They have documents for you, and for Mr. Mark Albright as well." My father froze, his half-eaten slice of pecan pie forgotten on his plate. The color drained from his face, leaving him suddenly gaunt. Mark sputtered, nearly choking on his wine. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled family members and guests. My mother's hand flew to her chest. The carefully constructed facade of the perfect family, the bastion of success and harmony, was about to crumble. I looked at my father, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. He met my gaze across the polished mahogany table, and in that instant, I saw it, the utter devastation of a man whose world, built on control and deception, was collapsing around him. He had sold my cottage, believing he was cementing his power, but instead, he had signed his own eviction notice from the kingdom he ruled. The silence that followed Jenkins' announcement was deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart. The game had officially begun. The hush in the room was absolute, a void where polite chatter had been seconds before. My father's face, usually a mask of composed authority, contorted in a way I'd never seen. It was a slow-motion unraveling, the shock of the summons hitting him like a physical blow. Mark, ever the fool, was already trying to bluster his way through, his voice a panicked squeak as he muttered something about a mistake, a misunderstanding. But the grim set of Jenkins' jaw, the way he held the neatly bound legal documents, told a different story. This was no mistake. This was war. My father's eyes finally found mine again. The initial shock had given way to a flicker of something far more dangerous, a desperate, cornered rage. He knew on some primal level that this was me. He hadn't confronted me, hadn't made a single move, yet the first domino had fallen. He tried to regain some semblance of control, pushing his chair back with a scrape that echoed in the silence. "This is a gross inconvenience," he announced, his voice still attempting its usual booming resonance, but cracking on the edges. "I have business to attend to." He rose, not looking at anyone, least of all me, and strode towards the exit. Mark scrambled after him, his earlier bravado evaporated, leaving only a pathetic dependency. My mother watched them go, her face ashen, a silent plea in her eyes that I wouldn't answer. The rest of the guests, a collection of business associates and distant relatives, exchanged nervous glances, their carefully curated smiles replaced by open curiosity and a palpable discomfort. The party, for all its opulence, had just imploded. I stayed at the table, my own unfinished pie a stark contrast to the legal storms brewing outside. I felt no triumph, not yet, just a cold, quiet certainty. This was just the opening act. The following days were a blur of legal strategy and a mounting sense of dread, mixed with an unshakable resolve. Miss Albright was a force of nature, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm she was orchestrating. She explained the complexities of the lawsuit, the fraudulent sale, the breach of fiduciary duty, the violation of Grandma's trust.
The initial papers filed were designed to freeze any assets my father might have been trying to liquidate, particularly those connected to the cottage. He had, in his arrogance, believed he could simply sell it, pocket the cash, and move on, a common tactic for him when a deal wasn't going his way, or when he needed a quick influx of capital. He never considered that Grandma's trust had teeth, that Uncle Robert was a steadfast guardian, or that I possessed a document capable of dismantling his entire carefully constructed empire. The cottage itself was the focal point, but the lawsuit quickly broadened. Miss Albright uncovered evidence of further mismanagement of family assets, of funds diverted to personal ventures, of a pattern of deception that stretched back years. My father, the titan of industry, the man who preached fiscal responsibility and shrewd business acumen, was apparently teetering on the edge of financial ruin, propped up by a series of increasingly risky gambles. The sale of the cottage was not a strategic move, it was a desperate act, a pawn sacrificed in a losing game. The legal notices served to Mark were equally damning. He'd been complicit, knowingly or unknowingly, in facilitating the sale, benefiting from the transaction. His future, tied so closely to my father's good graces and financial stability, was suddenly in jeopardy. I watched from a distance as their carefully constructed world began to fracture. Whispers turned into hushed conversations, then into open speculation. The business community, always so eager to laud success, was equally swift to condemn failure and scandal. My father, a man who had always thrived on public adoration and the perception of invincibility, found himself the subject of intense scrutiny. His carefully curated image began to erode, replaced by the specter of insolvency and deceit. He stopped returning my calls, which was, in itself, a victory. He had always reveled in his power to ignore me, to dismiss my concerns. Now he was being forced to confront them, albeit through lawyers and court documents. The emotional toll was immense. The anger that had fueled me for so long began to transmute into something heavier, something more akin to grief. Not grief for the loss of my father, but for the profound waste of what could have been. The potential for a real family, for genuine connection, shattered by his insatiable need for control and his inability to see beyond his own immediate gain. The cottage held so many memories, so many layers of my childhood. It was more than just a property. It was a sanctuary, a symbol of Grandma's enduring love. To see it treated so carelessly, so cynically, was a desecration. One afternoon, Uncle Robert called. His voice, usually so calm, held a tremor of concern. "Sarah, your father's lawyer contacted me. They're trying to discredit the trust, to say your grandmother wasn't of sound mind when she established it.
They're bringing up old family dramas, trying to paint a picture of you as unstable, as manipulated." He paused, a deep breath audible. "They're digging into everything they can find, trying to find something to use against us." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Of course they would. This was his modus operandi: deflect, attack, destroy any narrative that didn't serve him. He would try to turn my own family against me, to twist my history into a weapon. I thought of Aunt Carol, her subtle digs, her feigned concern that always seemed to have an undercurrent of judgment. Had my father already been whispering poison in her ear? "He's desperate, Uncle Robert," I said, my voice steady despite the churning in my gut. "And desperation makes people do ugly things. But Grandma's trust is ironclad, and you have the records. You've been documenting everything." "I have," he confirmed, his voice regaining some of its usual strength. "And I'm prepared to testify. Your grandmother was one of the sharpest, most clear-thinking women I've ever known. This is her legacy, Sarah. We have to protect it." The legal battles raged on. The court dates were set. The initial freeze on assets held. My father's businesses began to falter. Rumors of bankruptcy, of impending foreclosure, circulated like a contagion. Mark, stripped of his easy money and facing his own legal entanglements, became a ghost. He disappeared from the social scene, a shadow of his former boisterous self. I imagined him holed up somewhere, trying to figure out how his gilded life had turned so tarnished. The turning point came during a deposition. My father, under oath, was forced to confront the truth of his actions. The carefully constructed facade crumbled under the relentless questioning of Miss Albright. He stammered, he obfuscated, he lied, but the documentation was overwhelming. Grandma's trust, with its clear stipulations, stood as an unassailable barrier. His claims of acting in my best interest, of managing the property responsibly, were laid bare as pathetic attempts to cover his tracks. The transcript, when it landed on my desk, was a testament to his downfall. Page after page of his own words, exposing his greed, his deceit, his utter lack of remorse. The day of the public hearing arrived like a slow, inevitable judgment. The courtroom was packed, a morbid curiosity drawing in everyone from the financial press to distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. My father sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped, his once immaculate suit looking rumpled and ill-fitting. He avoided my gaze, his face a mask of grim resignation. Mark was beside him, looking utterly defeated. Miss Albright presented the case with a quiet precision, her arguments logical, unassailable. She laid out the timeline of Grandma's trust, the documented attempts my father had made to circumvent it, the irrefutable evidence of the fraudulent sale. Then she called Uncle Robert to the stand.
He was a study in quiet dignity, his testimony delivered with a soft-spoken conviction that carried more weight than any shouted accusation. He spoke of Grandma's foresight, her love for me, her deep concern about my father's impulsive nature. He detailed the ledger, the meticulous records he had kept at Grandma's behest. When my father's lawyer cross-examined him, Uncle Robert remained unruffled. He answered every question calmly, truthfully, his integrity a stark contrast to the desperate machinations of the defense. They tried to paint him as biased, as a disgruntled brother, but his quiet consistency and the sheer volume of documented evidence made their efforts futile. Then it was my turn. As I walked to the witness stand, the eyes of the courtroom felt like a physical weight. I took the oath, my voice clear and steady. I spoke of my love for my grandmother, of the cottage as a place of solace and cherished memories. I detailed my father's initial dismissal of my concerns, his evasiveness, his subsequent actions. I spoke of the discovery of Grandma's trust, the hope it ignited, and the realization of the depth of my father's betrayal. Mr. Albright, Miss Albright asked, her voice gentle but firm, "Why do you believe your father sold your cottage?" I looked across at him, his face etched with a weary defeat. "Because he needed the money," I said, the words carrying a quiet finality. He gambled, he spent, and when he ran out of resources, he saw my inheritance as just another asset to be liquidated. He believed he could get away with it because he always had. He underestimated my grandmother's love, and he underestimated me. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. The sale of the cottage was declared null and void. My father was ordered to pay restitution for the full appraised value of the cottage, plus substantial damages for breach of trust and fraudulent sale. The court also mandated a full forensic audit of his financial dealings, paving the way for further legal action. Walking out of that courtroom, the air felt lighter, clearer. The weight of humiliation, of betrayal, had been lifted. It wasn't a moment of joyous celebration. It was a moment of profound, somber relief. I had won. I had reclaimed what was mine, not just in terms of property, but in terms of truth and justice. My father, the man who had tried to erase me, was now a pariah. His empire, built on a foundation of deceit, was crumbling. I never spoke to my father again. The gulf between us was too wide, the wounds too deep. He became a recluse, his name synonymous with financial scandal. Mark, facing bankruptcy and criminal charges, eventually disappeared entirely. The family gatherings ceased to exist. The opulent estate became a monument to his downfall, a silent testament to his hubris. The cottage was eventually returned to my possession. It was empty, a little worn around the edges, but it was mine. I stood on the porch, the lake stretching out before me, the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no grand reconciliations, no tearful apologies, just the quiet, undeniable truth. Grandma's love had been my shield, her foresight my sword. I had walked through fire and emerged, not unscathed, but unbent. This was not about revenge, not really. It was about reclaiming myself, about proving that even when stripped bare, when dismissed and belittled,
there was a strength within that could not be broken. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet knowing that I had survived, and in surviving, I had finally truly won.